Great. So welcome everyone. We're going to talk about floodplain management higher standards today, and I'm going to turn off my camera because I know bandwidth might be a problem. And just a couple of logistics. We did turn off cameras for everybody attending. We did make it so you can turn your microphones on later when we have some time to ask some questions. The presentation will probably take the full hour, but we'll stick around and answer any questions and continue any discussion at 10:30 if folks are interested in sticking around. So also, if you have questions as we're going through, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and Matt will be trying to monitor those comments as we go. So starting off with what we're going to talk about today, just a quick reminder of some of the state's higher standards, because if you're comparing to the federal standards, we do have quite a few differences. Talk a little bit about why would you want higher standards, and then going into some specific examples, and then ending with some things that are not necessarily higher standards, but some other things that of you protecting the folks in your community and improving the environment in your community with some of these non-regulatory options. So a reminder that we've had the floodplain and shoreland regulations for over 50 years now, and we've got a lot of good higher standards in the state. Some of the specific higher standards are that we've got a higher minimum low floor requirement than the national standard. We limit stage increase from when you're squeezing in your floodplain and allowing filling and development on the edge of your floodplain. We don't allow increasing the flood elevation by more than 1/2 foot versus the national 1 foot. And we don't allow increases flooding on existing buildings. We do limit uses in the floodway, like for instance, most principal buildings and especially residential buildings, new ones and expansions are not allowed in the floodway. We have some pretty good language on not allowing pollutants to be stored in the floodway, and some zoning that applies beyond the FEMA mapped areas. For instance, we have language that says where the map and the actual ground elevations are not in sync, that the ground elevations apply, especially where they're lower areas, like on that left example here, where the building is clearly in a low area, that is supposed to be regulated. We also have rules, Minnesota rules, that say that we're regulating the area below our regulatory flood protection elevation. We've got the rule reference here, and those of you who have been at quite a few of our other basic trainings, we've been talking about this, that we actually regulate beyond where the mapped flood elevation is. We regulate the area covered by the regulatory flood protection elevation. So in flatter areas outside of shoreland districts, that can be an addition, an area that you may not have been regulating traditionally, but we've got that clarified in our current model ordinance. We have shoreland regulations, as I mentioned, since 1969, and that applies within 1,000 feet of lakes, 300 feet of public water courses, or it goes to the edge of the floodplain if that goes out further. So again, we've had these regulations for over 50 years. And in the shoreland districts, we regulate lot sizes, setbacks. We have more vegetation management requirements. We have some bluff protections. We limit impervious surface. We have a lot of good higher standards in place that they're not higher standards for your ordinances because they are the state minimums. Also, minimum elevations are required within the shoreland district. And in some areas, like in these unmapped counties, the counties that don't have FEMA floodplain maps, they still have a lot of lakes, and that's part of the reason why FEMA didn't produce floodplain maps in those counties, is because they have a lot of lakes, and we have our shoreland regulations that we require the minimum elevations and the setbacks and all those other good higher standards relative to other states. We've also had the public waters inventory program and regulate a lot of activities, the course current cross section of a lot of activities in those public waters. We've got the Wetland Conservation Act. So we have quite a few regulations, and more recently the buffer requirements. And we do have the mapping of what the buffer requirements are. So again, those are not actually higher standards, but a reminder that when you're talking with folks from other states, or people are consultants from other states may not be aware that we have those higher standards. But why would you want some higher standards in addition to what we've already got in state law? Well, there's a lot of things that really aren't covered by our current regulations that meet health and safety concerns, that even for current risks, we could be doing a better job of protecting those landowners in our communities and our emergency response folks. There's things that we could do to prevent making the flooding worse. And some of the regulations are aimed more at reducing pollutants going into the waters and retaining the natural vegetation and having that natural beneficial function of the floodplain and cleaning and recharging our aquifers and all those kinds of things. And from a practical standpoint, sometimes the regulations are considered because the communities know it will save their citizens money on their flood insurance, either now or in the future. And some communities are in the community rating system program. It's a FEMA program where if you have higher standards, you do a better job of communicating with the folks in your community. You do other things that are good overall for reducing risk and protecting people. You get more points for the more of those things you do. And that actually leads to discounts in the flood insurance rates for those who have policies in the community. So a lot of good reasons. When should you think about it in your community? Well, do you have higher risks in your community? Can you be doing more to protect those landowners and your emergency responders or first responders? Do you have updated data that you know the risk is higher than what's shown on the FEMA maps? Or you're in the process of getting better data because you suspect that better data would show that you've got higher risk than maybe you're showing on your maps. Because remember, FEMA maps are based on all the historical information, and they can't, because it's an insurance document, they can't show future conditions as the regulatory area. They can only show what's the current or past areas of risk. But the other thing is, if your community does have a lot of buildings at risk or with flood insurance policies, again, making that tie with the community rating system, or making it so that when people get rated for their flood insurance, that it's cheaper. Many of these things that we're talking about will help in those areas. Hinted at this already, but a few slides here on climate trends. And we will have a presentation that Kenny from our climatology office will be giving in March. I think that's March 7th. But talking about more in depth about some of the climate trends we're seeing. But we're definitely seeing more of our precipitation come in those bigger rains. Those 6-inch plus are 4 times more common than in previous decades. And we've got, as it says here, the 65% increase in the number of 3-inch plus rains. And I think we've all seen that. This is not news to people in our state. More recently, we saw records on the longest period that the Mississippi had been above flood stage in St. Paul. And the highest 7-year running period of precipitation, and we're seeing more risks of landslides, all those things related to climate trends. Here's a slide talking about how the water level stayed up for such a long time in 2019, and we're seeing those longer trends. The DNR does have this really nice climate change site, and on there's this cool tool where you can either look at the whole state or a particular watershed or adjoining watersheds and look at temperature trends and precipitation trends and some other cool things. You can play around with this. This is a public site. And here's one graph that the climatology folks put together in 2019, showing that the running 7-year high was in 2019, and we can see some general trends in how the water levels are going up, or this is precipitation amounts are trending up, and we are definitely seeing more of the wet years, but we're also seeing the drought like we experienced more recently. Some other risks that some of your communities may be experiencing: groundwater, high water tables in some areas are a big issue. And other parts of the state, we definitely have more issues with landslides and stream bank erosion. So some of the higher standards that are more targeted at those issues might be applicable in your community. Pluvial flooding is one of the terms we've started hearing in recent years, which is just another way of saying urban flooding or some of that localized flooding that's not necessarily associated with a river or a lake, but because you've got low areas and you're getting too much rain. And more communities are recognizing some of the areas that are not mapped by FEMA, some of those urban areas, the areas that are draining less than 1 square mile where FEMA doesn't normally map, and updating their maps and getting some great local maps. Oops, wrong way. And one last category of benefits to consider is with some of the higher standards that aim at retaining natural vegetation and retaining those natural functions of the floodplain, that in the long run is going to mean less erosion and less cost in expensive repairs to people fixing their shoreline because of what they did in the past, taking out all their natural vegetation that was providing that natural function of retaining the soil and preventing erosion, and also keeping good water quality. And good water quality, there's plenty of studies, and common sense tells you that that's tied to higher values. There's a higher life values and appreciation values of being able to use that lake during the summer because it's not full of algae and all kinds of, well, icky stuff there that people don't want to be swimming and boating in. And providing habitat. So lots of good reasons to have higher standards. Now, one thing I do want to mention is when you're looking at it for your community, you need to look at balancing people's rights. People do have property rights, and you're looking at how big is the impact if we have this higher standard. Are we addressing an issue that's really an issue? And one of the comments that someone made after the Shoreland virtual training that we gave here, I think it was last week, they made the comment, keep emphasizing that this is optional and reduces the rights of the property owner in order to protect shoreland environment and or views from lake. Some people like me like to see development from the lake. So, that's a very fair comment to be making, that look at balancing these things when you decide what kinds of higher standards you're going to have. You're not necessarily going to look at a higher standard on things like we don't want houses with polka dots or really fluorescent bright colors. That might be a concern for some people, but others think that's really cool to look at. So look at balancing that. And also look at what's defendable in court, that you're going to be treating people consistently. You're not going to be arbitrary and capricious, that you're addressing concerns that are there and you're balancing those concerns. And you want it defendable in court. And what we found is that when regulations are based on data, they're based on science, especially if they're quantifiable, you've got a model that says, or data that says, this is how high we think flooding's going to be. These are the areas we think are impacted. We know this percentage of impervious surface will lead to worse water quality. Those kinds of things are great support for the kinds of regulations you want to consider that are higher standards. And remember that usually people can sue for any reason. They can take the city or the county to court if they don't like your regulations. But what happens in court is that usually the community is going to win if they've got good science and good basis for their regulations. But they're most likely to lose if they did not enforce their regulations, especially if someone's impacted. And there's been quite a few court cases where that's happened. And even in Iowa, the DOT lost in court. And usually the state governments don't lose like that for road construction types of projects. But that is definitely something to keep in mind. And I'll mention a couple legal resources if this is a concern in your community. Some great resources at the Association of State Floodplain Managers. And I show a more recent document, 5 years ago from 2016 on some legal issues in upgrading your flood maps and showing local risk and risk due to climate change. This was a nice thing that was put out by the association. And they started looking at these things. The brochure on the right is from 1984, and they've been putting this out for a long time. And the fellow who wrote this, John Kusler, I'm not sure how to say his name. John unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but I had a chance to talk to him when I was at the ASFPM conference. We happened to be sitting next to each other on a bus to an evening event. And I found out he was involved in writing our shoreland management regulations back in the 60s. And he was the one who told me about how we took the Wisconsin shoreland regulations and made them better. They realized that we should have minimum elevations within the shoreland. Wisconsin doesn't have that. And also recognize that we shouldn't be treating all of our shorelands the same. So in Minnesota, we classified into our general development, recreational development, and natural environment classes and had different standards in those areas. That was a lesson John and others learned working with Wisconsin's regulations. So just have to mention that, seeing his name on these brochures. How do you put it into your ordinance? Many of these things can be incorporated in your floodplain ordinance, or if you don't have a floodplain ordinance, maybe in your shoreland ordinance or other regulations in your zoning ordinance. Sometimes it'll take a special district. Depends on what your priorities are, the kind of higher standards you're looking at. In the Minnesota model ordinance, our current updated version of the model ordinance, we've got blue bold lettering showing things that are either a higher standard or optional language that you don't have to have but might be a good idea. And actually in some cases it's allowing more flexibility or allowing more opportunities for ways to develop in your floodplain. But some of the things that are already in our model ordinance and that have been for quite a few years, and the first of these is talking about critical facilities, either keeping them higher or outside of the 500-year floodplain, that 0.2% annual chance floodplain. I'll have a few more slides about that later. Dry land access, having safe ways to get to the buildings during flooding. And in our model ordinance, we suggest that you have access no more than 2 feet below the regulatory flood protection elevation. We've had a cumulative substantial improvement regulation in our model ordinance for quite a few years, basically looking at improvements over the life of the structure. And if you don't want to go quite that long, what you could do is consider life over a 10-year period or some other period and look at what's common around the country. 10-year period is pretty common around the country, which is why I mentioned it here. And another thing that is in our model ordinance is some substantial damage language that's based on repetitive loss. Substantial damage has to have the language about the 50% rule, the 50% trigger, that if it's damaged such that the cost to repair that building's more than 50% of the market value. But if you include this language that says you've got 2 losses that average 25% damage within a 10-year period, that makes them eligible for some additional funds, additional insurance claim if they've got a flood insurance claim through that increased cost compliance rider in the flood insurance. So what we did find is that when we've got these in our model ordinance, most communities do adopt a lot of that language. And when we tried to suggest these separately, not as many communities adopted it. And some of them are just really good ideas that make sense. So what can communities do? We've got the higher standards that we're going to be talking about here, and that's one of the things in your toolkit. But if you want to go with a bigger toolkit, you could consider some watershed level planning. We've got the One Watershed, One Plan efforts going on around the state, some great work being done there. Many of our watersheds have some great planning. Many of our communities have great planning, but especially if you can work at the watershed level, that's even better. Now, I'll briefly talk about some risk communication and some policies that might make sense at the community level, things to encourage, but I'll be focusing mainly on some of our other higher regulation ideas here. And this is a little cartoon here. You've got the itsy bitsy spider in the water spout listening to the news saying a flash flood warning's in effect until 9 p.m. Oh my, thank heavens, I'm safe and dry in here. So kind of getting at the idea that a lot of people don't even know they're at risk, like the spider here. So one area that you can think about is regulating areas that are not shown on those FEMA maps. And one of the areas that we really encourage is looking at all those locally identified floodplain areas. They're not on the FEMA maps, but you've got them mapped. And a great example is City of Edina. I don't know if Jessica's on the call here today, but they've got a great mapping feature and some regulations, even of those local flood prone areas, recognizing that if you fill in those areas, you're going to impact somebody. So they retain that volume so that they don't impact others. And City of Mora adopted a more recent ordinance that's got similar ideas there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple other ideas, dam shadows, and meander belts here, but having some extra protection behind levees, or if you know that you've got regular ice jam problems, then looking at some maybe higher elevations or protections in those areas where you know you're going to get ice jams. This is showing an example from Wisconsin. They've actually got state rules, and I put the citation here at the bottom, but they look at what that hydraulic shadow would be if you mapped the area when a dam fails. And to my knowledge, they're the only state that has that requirement. But there may be others that have adopted it now. But if you've got dams in your community, this is something to definitely think about to protect your citizens. And we've got areas where we've got a lot of meandering. And this is an example where in the 2007 or 8, I think it was 2007 flood in Minnesota City, they had Garvin Creek move, and this is the result you saw, and it definitely impacted those buildings. And we use this slide, some of our other trainings, to talk about decks and things, but this just looks at the reality that streams are not stationary. They are moving, and they move within those meander areas. And so one thing that we'd encourage a community to think about, and I know some of our counties that have a lot of these streams where recent storms have caused buildings to be cantilevered a bit over the edge of the stream, that the stream's eroded significantly, and even homes that were set back quite a ways are at risk. So the concept is to look at where that meander belt would be, and DNR's done some studies in different parts of the states. They have some factors in the different kinds of regions depending on the topography and the slopes and how new or old that stream is. They have different criteria on how much you would expect those streams to meander within that belt. And so you could look at some great examples of communities, especially in other states. They've done some great work in Vermont and the state of Washington, where they've mapped where those meander belts are, and they don't allow people to do new building in those areas to protect people for the future. And so you would have a mapped area, so you've got a way to regulate that more easily. And the mapping you would do would be based on that science for your community. Another thing that we look at is reducing risk outside the special flood hazard areas in general. Talked about you could have regulations similar to the shoreland regulations, and the floodplain regulations apply community-wide. Some communities that don't have shoreland management regulations now, especially a lot of the cities that were lower priority, they didn't get a formal letter from DNR saying you must adopt shoreland regulations. If you've got shoreland areas, go ahead and adopt those regulations now and protect your citizens for the future. And consider minimum elevations or setbacks in your whole community. So for that, I've got an example in Plymouth, and I use this for a national presentation, so I know most of you know where Plymouth is, but I left this in my presentation here. So Plymouth, back in the 80s, 90s, was growing like crazy. They had all kinds of developments going in. I show the Wild Wings development here was under construction. I was the area hydrologist in Plymouth in the late 80s, first half of the 90s. And I got to find it, but I had some great pictures of foundations in this area right next to the wetland. And they looked like a bathtub. They looked like a pool because there had been a big rain, they were under construction, they got filled in, and there were no regulations because it wasn't a shoreland. It was a public water, so they had an ordinary high. They had to stay outside the ordinary high, but there were no setback requirements. There were no minimum elevation requirements. And I made comments during the PUD the plat came out, but they didn't have to follow the minimum setbacks or elevations I suggested. And they went ahead and built, and they had people get flooded. Another example here was the Seven Ponds addition. It was called Seven Ponds because they had a bunch of little ponds and wetlands within the addition. And another one where I made recommendations that, gee, these are areas that are at risk. You should have them set back a little bit or have some minimum elevations. And the developer said, oh, well, people don't need yards here. It's going to be empty nesters building here. And I'm like, really? And at the time I had young kids, and I said, you're marketing this to people like me that have young kids that want a backyard. And they had like 10-foot areas in the backyards. They were 10, maybe 20 feet from the edge of the wetland. And the city, the developer and the city told them, well, if DNR will let you do it, then you can do it. So I had like a third of the people in the development call me and ask what they could do. They wanted to put their patio. They wanted to mow in the wetland. They wanted to fill a little bit. And I had to tell all of them, no, you can't do any of that. If it's below the ordinary high, you can't do anything. You can't fill. And I think a few people got upset and talked to the city council, and they ended up, and this is where those developments were, but they ended up adopting some great regulations. They ended up adopting some requirements that every new building was going to be 2 feet, have their lowest floor 2 feet above the 1% annual chance flood that was in that sub-watershed area, whether they were in a floodplain or shoreland or not. And they had a great stormwater plan where they had all that data to support those requirements. And they also went through and did an inventory of all their wetlands and divided it into high quality and medium, and I forget how many classes, but they had several classes of wetland quality, and then they had different setbacks and buffer areas around each of those. And they required that they have, here's an example of a high quality wetland. They had a 50-foot buffer in that case because it was a high quality wetland. And then they had a setback requirement. And they also started requiring monuments, which were basically a 4x4 post. And here you can see it says wetland buffer edge. And I don't know if anybody from Plymouth got on the training today. I know Ben was registered last moment, so might have gotten on. But one thing I would like to see is learn more about is how this is held up over time, because this was, again, in the 90s. So Plymouth was really forward thinking and helping to protect those future developments, partly because they saw the negative impacts of not having these regulations and not having these protections for their citizens. Moving on to talk about critical facilities and how important that is. And I think many of you saw these pictures in Cedar Rapids in 2008, where they had a hospital and correctional facilities and all kinds of critical facilities that were flooded. And some of these really important facilities were on an island in the middle of the river and created huge problems for the community. And getting people moved from hospitals, getting people moved from prisons that are in hard to access areas is something communities need to think about and try and prevent with new ones. Owatonna, we've got this example here of the tank being flooded. They made some changes later. Here's a new house where they were flooded here at this well house, Methodist Hospital in St. Louis Park, how they had to do extra effort because they were in more flood prone areas. This slide is from a FEMA national training, at least it was in the old materials, probably 15 years ago. I don't know if they still have this in their materials, but the example they used of a critical facility and why it's important was from Rochester, Minnesota. And those of you familiar with the Rochester flood in 1978 know that there were several people who died in this facility. 2 or 3 people, I can't remember exactly. As you can see in the picture, that they couldn't get in there and protect them because they were in a high-risk area. So going forward, you want to build things correctly and protect people in your community. One of the good resources you can be looking at is the ASCE 24-14. It's a booklet with some specific building code guidelines, and it breaks buildings into flood classes 1, 2, 3, 4. Class 3 is things like the schools and prisons and some large group facilities. At this national level, they talk about base flood elevation plus 1 foot. Our state standards already that or higher, depending on if you have a stage increase to add. But where this is a more restrictive than our current state minimum is in the class 4 buildings, those buildings that or facilities that are essential for emergency response and recovery. And in those areas, the guidelines there, the regulations in that document require that you have those low floors at the base flood elevation plus 2 feet, or at the 500-year, whichever is higher. And related to this, want to make everybody aware that the Department of Labor and Industry, our state building code folks, are currently going through the process of revising the Minnesota Rule 1335, which is about floodproofing. Basically, that rule currently refers to or adopts by reference the 1972 Corps of Engineer floodproofing regulations. And as we joke about at some of our trainings, that document is older than probably the majority of our floodplain managers and local officials that are working with the regulations at the local level now. And so this is great that this is getting updated. And in fact, on February 7th, they just posted the request for comments in the Minnesota State Register. So this is in process and becoming the state standard. You can see a nice highlight of what is in that document that FEMA's got on their website. But, and this is really busy, but the kinds of things that are that flood design class 4, hospitals, fire, rescue, ambulances, police stations, designated emergency shelters, power generating, other public utilities, communication towers, electrical substations, most of your community level utilities, and emergency response and medical and all those kinds of things. So in our latest model ordinance, we have tweaked the language in there to be consistent with what is a critical facility, and we're using that ASCE 24-14 definition in our previous model ordinance, listing out critical facilities, but there are a few differences using that same language. We want to be consistent with what's going to be the future requirements. And we have the regulations that are consistent with that ASCE 24-14 of the 2 feet above the base flood elevation or above the 500-year, whichever's higher. So some other common standards we see in other communities is not requiring or not allowing any new structures in their floodplain in general, or in at least a couple cases in their 500-year floodplain, and some other higher minimum elevation requirements. And one of our best examples that has been in place for over 10 years, it's been quite a while now, maybe closing on 20 years, is in Nicollet County, that they say no new structures within the 500-year floodplain. And honestly, that started because the floodplain administrator at the time, they didn't realize that there were differences in the dark gray versus the light gray areas. And she was telling people, you can't build new buildings in this gray shaded area. And then when she realized that the 500-year and the 100-year grays were different, then they worked at the community level and actually adopted regulations consistent with that requirement she had already been enforcing. But other counties, especially after big floods here after the 2007 and 2008 and 2010 floods in southern Minnesota, some of those counties adopted higher standards. Dodge, for example, although they more recently now are allowing one accessory for buildings for buildings for those that were already in the floodplain. Chisago was another one that I found out more recently that isn't allowing new structures. And a lot of the small cities, they don't currently have buildings in the floodplain. And so when they get into the National Flood Insurance Program and they adopt an ordinance with us, a lot of times we adopt what we call a simplified ordinance. We say, just tell people that new buildings aren't allowed in the floodplain. You don't have building pressure there. Prevent there being problems in the future. And a lot of small communities have done that. They've got plenty of areas to build that are safe outside of their flood prone areas. And they just adopt that simplified ordinance saying, we're not going to allow any new buildings in our high risk areas. I mentioned the dry land access, that you have minimum elevations so that buildings are not left on little islands surrounded by flood areas. And again, great idea, because you don't want people stranded. You don't want people put at risk trying to get people to and from the buildings. And most deaths do occur because of people crossing areas that they think they can get through, but they might be deeper and faster velocity than they expected. Or there could have been a big chunk of the road that got eroded and there's a big hole where the road used to be. So a great example of something to adopt if you don't have it in your ordinance. And many communities do have some higher standards. And one example is in Mower County, and I see Angie, looks like she's on here. But in Mower County, the floodplain administrator, Angie, was pointing out to the board what they had to do to calculate the low floor, how they had to figure out what the flood elevation was, and then go to this page here and that page there in the flood says, and then add that stage increase to the footer freeboard, and that's your regulatory flood protection elevation. And the board agreed, well, that's kind of complicated to have to go through all those steps. We can adopt a 2-foot freeboard. It's always going to be higher than the minimum would be if we did all those extra calculations and did that extra work looking in the flood insurance study. And Angie is saying that's correct. She doesn't have she's not speaking now, or I'm not on the speaker, but that's a great way to present this is nobody else in the nation has the kind of regulatory flood protection elevation that we do, where we have to calculate what that stage increase and add that. So, going just up to a 2-foot, a little bit more protection is a really easy sell in many communities, especially if you show your decision makers what you have to do to calculate it. And just a quick note that we're fortunate in Minnesota that we've got watershed districts, and a few slides that I use when I'm talking to national groups is letting them know that we've had these watershed districts. They've been authorized since 1955. You can find out more about watershed districts on the Bowser site or the Maud site, but they've got the authority to adopt rules, and they can be higher regulations. So there's many parts of our state where we've got watersheds that have higher rules that apply also in your communities. So not a surprise to you where the watersheds are. They're really focused in the metro area, and along the Red River Valley area, areas where we've had more problems with flooding in the past. So they've often got some great higher standards. And also many of the watersheds in cities have been doing some good work in updating their modeling using Atlas 14. And I don't have slides on that in this presentation, but I'm sure many of you have seen slides or have heard about Atlas 14, basically an update of the precipitation records and adding an additional about 50 years of records compared to the TP40 that came out in 1960 and was using those older records. And in parts of the state, Atlas 14 shows a 25–30% increase in what we would consider that 100-year, 24-hour rain, or the other frequencies of flooding have gone up if you look at that additional years of records. And again, that's not even looking at future conditions modeling. And that's something that some communities are looking at, future conditions modeling, either ultimate development, future development, or those kinds of things. And you can, and many of the watersheds do then regulate based on their updated modeling. And many of the watersheds will have a 2-foot freeboard instead of our 1 to 1.5 foot over the base flood elevation that we have as the state minimum. And I'll mention some limiting impervious surface too. But our frequencies that we have available for the newer, well, traditionally, when we've got detailed studies for the FEMA maps, we've got that 10, 25, 50, 100 year, and or the 10, 50, 100 year, and the 500 year. And more recently, we've been adding the 25 year and something called the 100 year plus. And that's recognizing that when they're calculating that 100-year flood elevation, there's a range based on that historical information, the kinds of assumptions being made, the kinds of modeling being done. For the regulatory purposes, we take the median of that 1%, but we can have that data available for what that 1% plus, that upper end, that 95% percentile of oh shoot, I'm missing the wording there, but that you're looking statistically at the likelihood of what that flood elevation would be. So some communities are starting to look at using that 1% plus instead of just the 1% that is in the regulations. Another thing some communities could look at is, what's the difference between the 100-year and the 500-year? And in this example, they've got a big area on a bigger river where it's about 2-foot difference. So why not look at least a 2-foot freeboard requirement in that community? Again, look at what are the situations in your community. How flashy are the streams there? What is the difference between the 500 and the 100-year? Many communities require elevating above that 500-year. Something to think about depending on your community. And here's an example that we like to use from the Charlotte, North Carolina area, the Charlotte Mecklenburg County area. And they, on their official maps, have the FEMA map and where flood insurance is required. And they've got that in this bluish color. But then they also show what they call the community flood fringe area, which is the area that they know is covered by floods based on the calculations that they've done for full development. And so they're looking at what the minimum should be for any new development in those areas now. Some of the communities have additional limitations on impervious surface. They're having maybe the shoreland standard of 20% in their whole community. Minnehaha Creek's got an interesting one where they limit the impervious surface within the 10-year floodplain. The 10-year floodplain is another thing to consider for allowing development or setbacks in general also. And then reducing runoff and not allowing the peak to increase that runs off sites. So I'm going to run through just a few quick examples. Here's a water detention in a place where they added some new parking areas. This happens to be where I voted at, and I took the picture when I was voting that day. This is another example in my community where they've got this ponding basin, and this was after a couple 3-inch rain. So not too bad, but it's designed for those bigger rains. But during the dry periods, it's multi-use. They're using it in this example. We've got a bunch of elementary school kids out there playing soccer. Bassett Creek's got some great examples that they showed on a tour not too long ago for their 50th anniversary, where they've got a ponding area and they've got some below ground basins that are, you can't see in this picture, but they're there. Others require greater compensatory storage. Dakota County requires a volume of 2-to-1 storage to the filling. And some other examples of rain gardens. And some of these may have been done with grants, more necessarily requirements. So here's an example in obviously a Target parking lot. And of course, limiting snow storage. Here's an example in a small community, and they had this great sign here in Madison Lake, talking about their rain garden and educating at the same time that they were doing some things to improve the retention of the water and cleaning there. So some other things, better communication. We've got some of these non-regulatory products that can be helpful for that we talk about in other trainings. We've got some educational materials on encouraging people to leave the natural shoreline. And we've got several links here. And thanks to Stearns Soil and Water Conservation District and Murray County, they provided some really nice photos that we included in these documents. Oh, and I want to mention we've got the DNR Maintaining and Restoring Natural Shorelines page has been reorganized to put more of those resources in one place, make them easier to find. Here's an example where you can see the natural vegetation area is not eroded, but the area where it had been removed was removed. And then ending with just a few pictures that are close to home for me and getting communities to consider their mowing practices, which this is a current challenge in my own neighborhood. Here's a little pond that I walk around most days at lunch, especially during the nice weather, and nice little naturalized area. And I was out there, and unfortunately in the middle of the summer, they go and mow everything in this area around the pond. And then there's this big hill where it's a big open spot because it used to be the city dump, and now it's just a covered up big hill that's got vegetation on it. And the picture I had taken a day or two before with this monarch on this on the milkweed just next to the path looked like this the next day after they had mowed. Another picture I had taken because I was trying to figure out what this plant is, and I've learned when I gave this presentation last year, it's a mullein, I think it's pronounced, but that's what it looked like after the mowing. So trying to encourage better regulations and policies. And here's some resources that are at the ASFPM page. They've got a great resource here on developments and regulations. We've got our innovative shoreland showcase page with those things that are more focused in the shoreland areas, but a lot of great ideas applicable in general and in floodplain areas. And ending the story here with our itsy bitsy spider is prepared for the next flood in this little cartoon. And when I send out the PDF of the slides, I do have to take out the cartoon, sorry, because I didn't get permission to use those. But ending here. And even though I started late, we actually ended on time. So want to say thanks to everyone for attending, and we'll stop recording, but if folks have questions,